Okay, I know that back in December I posted a video where I basically said I'm back, and then I posted one video after that, and then I just sort of disappeared for a couple of months. Truth is, none of this was planned. I had been experiencing a lot of stuff going on in my life. There was this constant rataplan of things popping out of the woodwork and problems that needed to be resolved and some various stuff going on that I don't want to go on about in public. And it all added up to me having that much less time than I really would have liked. And this all came on top of me engaging with what amounted to 3 creative projects all sort of coming to a head at once. There's 2 books that I was working on, and I was talking about this before on this channel. One's called Pavilion 7, and the other's called Charisma. They're both more or less done, but I just needed to carve out the time to get them through the final rounds of edits and put together all of the front and back matter, the graphics and all the rest of it, and finally push them into production. And I'm still grinding my way through all of that because, again, this was happening on top of a bunch of other stuff that I don't want to go on about in public. But things have finally started to fall into place at least a little bit. There's still a lot of uncertainty, but I wanted to carve out a little time to finally sit down and start making a couple more videos. And I'm hoping that all of the uncertainty that I'm looking at will get resolved in the next few weeks. And unfortunately, they could resolve itself in one of 2 ways. One being that I do have that much more time, guaranteed. And another way being that I don't have that much more time, guaranteed. So it could wind up being something that would either be very good or very bad. And I don't like the fact that it's just uncertain either way. I like having a little certainty in my life. I've spent a lot of time in my life teaching myself how to live with uncertainty gracefully. And I tell you, that's a lesson that no matter how many times you internalize, it never quite completely sticks with you. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to try to shoot that much more stuff in a somewhat more off-the-cuff format so that I don't have to think too much about what I'm doing, for lack of a better word. I can just sit down and do it. And in a way, that's kind of what I've wanted to do. I've wanted to be a little bit more spontaneous about this. And now it seems like I don't have a choice in the matter. So with that out of the way, I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the things that I've been reading when I can find the time to do it. It's actually something that I did a quick read of, and quick meaning over the course of about 3 or 4 weeks because it was so big. And then now I'm in the process of sitting down and going through it in a much more granular fashion. And the book in question is The Penguin History of the World. And this is the 6th edition. And as you can see from all the flags, this is where I currently am in my reread. You can see the latest flag in the bookmark, but I've actually already gone through the whole thing at least once. And as the title implies, this is a very large, systematic, distilled history of the world, primarily the Western world, but also a fair amount of information about Asia and India. Although, honestly, if you want the full skinny on the history of India, the history of Africa, and all the rest of it, I am probably going to be digging up separate works about those specific subjects, in big part because they really do demand their own in-depth treatment. But one of the great things about a book like this, even when there are places where it doesn't go into the full depth that you would hope for, is that it gives you a nice 30,000-foot view of how all the big pieces do fit together. Where did civilization, as we could call such a thing, begin? And the short answer is it didn't begin in any one place. It began in lots of different places and in lots of different forms. And over time, those different manifestations of things that we could call civilization started more and more to resemble each other, although they had a tremendous amount of local difference. The way that ancient Egypt manifested, for instance, came out very differently from the way ancient Greece manifested, which came out very differently from the way ancient Mesopotamia manifested. Not just because of who the people were, but because of what the geography was like and what the local pressures were like. And the book does a very good job of laying this stuff out side by side and showing you how these things developed over time into the civilizations that we all find familiar. And I think the best thing about having a book like this is that I've noticed, especially in my case, I've had for the longest time a very patchwork kind of understanding about world history. I knew a fair number of things, but they were not systematized. They didn't really fit together into a single coherent picture. And that always bothered me because I would feel like I would have some sense of how things were, for instance, in the Greco-Roman era, but not so much about what its immediate successor was, or how they connected to each other, how one flowed into each other. There would be these gaps. I would go straight from that to say, the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages. So one very nice thing about a book like this is that it gives you a way to take all of those disjointed pieces of history you may have picked up through high school and perhaps college, and maybe also through all of the rest of your reading, and fit them together. And if you're thinking about a story where the sweep of history matters, even if only in the sense of it being something that people learn about in school, or certainly in the sense of something that matters and that it influences the way people are living their lives now, where did we come from, that kind of thing, to see how all of that can be stitched together and made into a narrative, that's a really good instructive example, I think, for something that you can do on your own. I'm not saying that you would have to write a history of whatever world you're going to write about in the same degree of detail and with the same degree of synthesis and overview that you would see in something like this. What I'm saying is that when you read a book like this, you get an idea for how something like that can be done both at the small level and at the big level. You get an idea for how it can be done in the sense of describing how one way of living for a whole group of people flowed into and influenced and evolved into and became a way of living for a whole nother group of people. And that's a really useful skill to develop, that sense of how about a history being a river, basically. When you want to write about a story, if you want to write a story about how things are changing and how those changes are not always going to be obvious to the people that they're happening to. Sometimes they're only obvious at the level of a historian. I don't think that the ancient Greeks were thinking of themselves as the ancient Greeks. They certainly didn't think of themselves as ancient. They thought of themselves as people of the moment. They were at the very forefront of history as they saw it. And so, to be able to capture a little bit of that for yourself in your story, and to be able to put yourself in the mindset of people who are at a particular moment in time and don't know it, that's a handy thing to have. And I think reading a history with this kind of breadth, if not always a whole lot of depth, can give you some sense of how that can be accomplished. Now, I also don't think that by any measure this needs to be the only history book that you would have. I mean, I hinted before about how if you wanted to go further into the history of the Indian or African subcontinents, you'd want to do that. And you'd want to do that by way of works that were specifically designed, to unpack all of the details that are relevant there and lay them out in a coherent way. One of the other books that I talked about before was To Hell and Back, which was a history of Europe from the World War I and World War II periods. And it is designed to show you specifically how those two great conflicts arose from the circumstances that existed at the time, how they shaped everything, what they left in their wake, and also how talking about these things can be so much more than just a description of who fought whom when. There were enormous sociological implications for both world wars. They changed societies so drastically that we're still grappling with the consequences, 150 and 75 years later. So more specific works about a specific period or a specific nation, a specific people, those are great follow-ups to having something like this. But I'm really beginning to feel like a lot of us do have this kind of generally disconnected sense of history as we could grasp it in the whole. And that it's really useful to have at least one work like this, one big distillation, and to use that as a jumping off point, not to use that as the be all and end all, but to use that as a place to get a sense of how to synthesize what the history of everything we've experienced so far is a little bit like, and where each one of us could drill down from there to find the things that we find interesting. Like, I've always been fascinated with Japan, and I had at one point a very good history of Japan, and then I had to part with it when I moved. And at some point, I'm probably going to reacquire it and sit down with it and reread it in light of everything that I've been reading most recently with regard to history. And I think I'm going to get a very different set of understandings out of it than I did before. That's a good thing. It means that I've learned how to read history that much more effectively. And that in turn means that I can take the lessons that I see there and make them that much more effectively part of whatever story I want to tell. And I'm not talking about doing something simply like researching a particular historical period so I can recreate the details of that period in my story, because that's that's a fairly standard thing to do, and there's nothing wrong with it. But I feel like that's only the beginning. I feel like there's a lot more that can be done. I feel like that one of the other things that you can do, again, is get a sense of how that moment in time is only one moment in time with a great deal before it and a great deal after it, and how the movement of that moment in time is something that happens above and beyond everybody that's in it, and that they're not always aware of it. That, it allows you to write about historical forces and the way that history is highly impersonal. There may be great individual figures in history, the names of great leaders, the names of tyrants, the names of great thinkers, but every single one of them, to me, has always seemed to be at least as much at the mercy of the history they live in as much as they do shaping it. And that was actually something that I really grappled with when I was watching and reading about Oppenheimer, and the way that people would single him out as being basically the father of the atomic bomb and the nuclear era, and for all of the way that he shaped the period that he lived in, he was also very much a victim of it. So I want to recommend this as a good place to start if you are stalwart enough to go through it at that length, because it is something like, I'm going to do a page count now, minus the index, it's about 1,190 pages. And I don't recommend that you try to read something like this all in one sitting. That's not what I did. That's not the way I would ever ask anybody else to do it. Do it in stages, do it in slices. And when you do that, it's also easier for this stuff to leaf in itself into your mind and to give you a sense of, what else are you curious about as you're going along? One of the other things I found when I was reading this was that it reawakened my curiosity about Egyptian history, of which there is which took place over an enormous span of time, and where we have not nearly as much detail as we would like, but at the same time, the details that we do have are tantalizing. And that's something I want to see if I can get a specific work on and unpack even further. And finally, if you are intimidated by the sheer physical bulk of the book, there is a digital edition. This is not one of those books that necessarily needs the presentation to be effective. In fact, if anything, it may be more effective digitally because you can freely index and shuffle through it. But what can I say? I have a thing for big chunky books sitting on my shelf. So yeah, Penguin History of the World, 6th edition, highly recommended. Dive in, see what you think, and until next time, stay curious.